Alexandra, and thank you all of you for joining us in this kind of wonderful panel. And today's panel is titled Representing the Colonial Other, Colonial Artifacts and Polish Engagements in the Reproduction of Colonial Knowledge from late 19th century until, kind of at the cusp of 19th and 20th century. And we're going to start with Leni Valerio, who is an associate director in the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. And she received her BA in history from the University of Puerto Rico and a PhD from the University of Michigan. And Urena Valerio is the author of An Empire of Scientific Experts, Polish Physicians and the Medicalization of the German Borderlands from the kind of late 19th century until the 1918 when Poland gained independence. So Leni, the floor is yours, 10 minutes.
Thank you so much for that kind, sorry, I need to unmute myself. No, I'm fine. So thank you so much for that kind introduction. I want to thank the conference organizers for giving me the opportunity to participate and share my work with all of you today. So the goal of my presentation is to recast the role that Polish explorers had in the colonial world and their involvement reproducing colonial knowledge in Europe and the Polish lands. By studying the works of Leopold Janikowski and Jan Czekanowski, I seek to understand the place that overseas colonies had in Polish national agendas and the role that the act of collecting and showcasing cultural artifacts had disseminating racialized knowledge. My overall aim is to critically engage Polish endeavors in overseas colonies to highlight political tensions, cultural paradoxes, and illuminate the reverberation of colonial knowledge into the everydayness of Polish society. The information presented here is part of my book, Colonial Fantasies, Imperial Realities, where I study Polish and German relations using a post-colonial framework, and I follow Polish and German activities in three contexts: the eastern borderlands of the German Empire, the German colonies in Africa, and the Polish colonial settlements in Brazil. I am interested in the work of Leopold Janikowski because he was one of the members of the first Polish expedition to Africa, led by Stefan Scholz-Rogozinski in Cameroon in the early 1880s. The initiative was called the First Polish Expedition because rather than exploring under the service of other empires, Rogozinski turned to Polish writers and organizations to raise funds to study the unknown lands of Cameroon. The explorer proposed to fill out this blank region, according to him, this blank region not yet penetrated by other European nations, and he intended to give Poles a place among the great 19th century European discoverers. The failed expedition, frustrated by Germany's declaration of Cameroon as a protectorate in 1884, has been largely ignored by scholars in Polish studies. Many historians have entirely dismissed the question of Polish colonial imagination because for a long time, Poland was considered the victim of imperial aggressions. And consequently, their works have been mainly guided by ideas of national revival and nation building. For me, however, studying the relationship with overseas colonies makes no sense without, for many, the study of studying Polish connections with the overseas colonies makes no sense because of the inexistence of the nation state. But for me, the first Polish expedition to Africa is a highly significant episode in Polish history because of the intellectual discussions it generated at the time in Polish society about the feasibility of obtaining colonies, the comparison critics and supporters of the expeditions made with other Europeans, and the centrality given to the act of deriving knowledge, scientific knowledge from the colonies. I cannot go much into the details of the expedition here, but one aspect that I want to highlight are the rich description that Janikowski and also Rogozinski provided in their accounts about local populations, their drive to collect artifacts, and the circulation of both this knowledge and the materiality produced by the expedition. While in Africa, the explorers sent news to British, French, and German scientific journals, and as well as to Polish language newspapers across the partition lands. A trip to Gabon that the explorers made in 1884 produced a significant number of cultural artifacts that the explorers sent to Krakow. This collection and other objects they brought back from West Africa were influential in founding ethnographical museums in both Warsaw and Krakow. Janikowski's uncollected items from the colonies were exhibited in the Warsaw Zoological Garden in 1888. The exhibition was then moved permanently to the Museum of Industry and Agriculture. And in his memoir, Janikowski stated that his African materials set the beginning of the ethnographic museum in Warsaw, which was founded in 1921. Rogozinski, on the other hand, gave his collected items to two supporters of the expedition from Krakow. He donated his anthropological collection composed mainly of skulls to Dr. Isidor Kopernitsky, a physician and anthropologist of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, and his ethnographic collection to Adrian Baraniecki, a physician and founder of Technical Industrial Museum. I should say that Isidor Kopernitsky studied several groups in the region, in Poland, mainly the Roma population. So upon the return to Europe, both Janikowski and Rogozinski gave lectures about their experiences. Their presentations were often accompanied by showing the cultural artifacts gathered in the territories. And according to Janikowski's memoir, the ethnographic material that he collected in Gabon were provided by natives in exchange of food, small gifts, and money. So contrary to the Polish character of Janikowski's expeditions in West Africa, Jan Czekanowski went to the continent in the early 20th century working under the auspices of the German Empire. He joined one of the largest interdisciplinary studies of East Central Africa undertaken by Germans in the colonial period. The expedition, led by Duke Adolf Friedrich from Mecklenburg, aimed to examine the, again, unknown stretches of the land. It aimed to collect data about the races of native peoples and learn about the spread of diseases that were indigenous to the region. Czekanowski was appointed by the Royal Ethnological Museum of Berlin and headed the anthropological and ethnographical sections of the expedition. This expedition was organized a few years after the conclusion of the work of the Anglo-German Commission, which lasted from 1902 to 1905. And that set and settled the boundaries of the German and British protectorates. And the expedition was also organized towards the ends of the Maji Maji uprising, which lasted from 1905 to 1907. One of the main purposes of the expedition that Czekanowski participated was to obtain a thorough assessment of the bordering provinces and consider the suitability of the area for the settlement of white colonists. Czekanowski was in charge of studying the racial components of peoples and their territorial distribution. He was also in charge of classifying languages and carry out a sociological study of higher form of state organization in the area. He collected skulls and skeletons that he sent to Felix von Luschan, the curator of the African and Oceania Department in the Royal Ethnological Museum. He also measured body parts and took photographs of different native groups. Parts of the collected material that Czekanowski gathered were first exhibited in Berlin in 1909, and then distributed to various museums and scientific institutions throughout Germany, particularly to the already mentioned Ethnological Museum in Berlin and the Ethnographic Museum in Leipzig. The expedition gave Czekanowski immediate international recognition since most of his work were published in German in major scientific journals. Some of his works were also translated in Polish. And although Czekanowski in his writing generally posed strong criticism to the various colonial systems in East Central Africa, his participation in the expedition made him an important collaborator of European powers by the very act of collecting, classifying, and creating knowledge about the region that supported colonial agendas. With these scientific measurements and observations, Czekanowski grouped bodies into different races and ethnic groups according to the societal organizations, the language they spoke, and the level of progress the scientific gaze considered they had obtained. So studying the unknown cultures, again, in Africa, served not only the purpose of preserving them in museums for European consumption, but also of rendering populations visible and vulnerable for colonial control. And I think that's my 10 minutes, so I'll stop here. Thank you so much. Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you, Lenny, for this wonderful talk. I think I really have to read your book because it sounds really fascinating. And now we're going to move to Adriana Avram. Adriana Avram is a PhD researcher who is doing her PhD in cultural studies at the Center for Excellence in Image Study at the University of Bucharest. And she's also a curator at the Astra Museum in Sibiu for the extra European collections. So Adriana, the floor is yours, 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, hello. I'd like to thank the organizers for having me in this conference, which is obviously very important for my research and also for the chance for disseminating my research. I will try to share with you today a small piece of information about our museum in Romania. My presentation tries to focus on the colonial dimension in World Culture Museum, which is Franz Binder Museum. This is the overview that I hope will keep me grounded and not divagate. So I will start now briefly with the presentation of the museum, just to present to you the context of my research. So this is the only museum in Romania that focuses on extra-European ethnography. It is part of a larger complex, which is Astra National Museum Complex, which is the largest ethnographic complex in Romania, complex of museums, so it comprises 4 museums, and this is one of them. Franz Binder Museum is under the organization procedure since 2015. So it is now a challenge for us to reorganize the main exhibition that was up for more than 20 years, because the museum was initially born in 1993, and the main exhibition was not changed ever since up to 2015. So the way it was conceived in the early 90s was still on and exhibited in like 5 years ago. So it is now, we have this challenge in order to connect all the collections, because the collection that gave the name to the museum that was donated by Franz Binder is only one of the many collections that the museum now holds. Franz Binder was an explorer, let's say. Now we choose to identify him by this label, but I'll get into it later. In the 19th century, he traveled as a lonely adventurer to North Africa and the Middle East, first in the Middle East and then North Africa, where he developed well-established trade. He was a pharmacist as a formation, as education, but he chose not to be in this area of business. So yes, he's from Transylvania. The museum is located in Sibiu in Transylvania, here in Romania, which at that time was also part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it was not part of Romania at that time, Transylvania. So Franz Binder chose to travel east based on personal reasons. He was not part of an exhibition, which I consider to be important for the way his travels and his future endeavors developed. His formation as scientist led him to collect ethnographic pieces, what is now considered to be ethnographic pieces, in his travel to Egypt, and then he established in Sudan and was their chancellor and representative of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for a few years in the early 1860s. At the same time, he was developing trade. He was a businessman, actually. And the image that we have of him now is that, and the image that the museum has chosen over the year to project about Franz Binder, which was, of course, the one to give the name, the founder of the museum, is that of a romantic hero, an adventurer, an explorer, science servant who was eager to know other cultures and to bring back home testimonies of human diversity. So this is the, let's say, the main trait, the main discourse that we used to have about Franz Binder so far. Actually, further research proved to us that the moment he left North Africa, the moment he left Khartoum, he was, if not the richest, but one of the richest European in Northern Africa, which of course poses some questions about his business there and about his way of trading, and actually what was the general context and the provenance of his collection and what he has brought over here. I've quoted some sources that we have. Of course, we have the scientific archive of the museum, where we have the journal of Franz Binder. It's only in German, the original, but we also have a translation in Romania made by the museum. But it's the only source we have, because in 1862, when he finally came back and never left Transylvania again, he chose to not only to donate his collection to the Transylvanian Society for Natural Sciences, but also to publish a journal, a mini series in the local media, in Transylvania Review, in order to project his own narrative of his travels and his adventures as he presents them, and so on, and the way he obtained the collections. So that was the initial journal, the initial material that the museum has worked with. There's also this material and also inside stories from the family have been taken over by his nephew, Kurt Binder, which in the 30s published again, let's say, a more official considered a journal of Franz Binder, but it's not first-hand account. It's just based on the initial publishings. And further on, we have now independent research conducted by Andres Stiensen, Franz Binder, a European Arab in the Sudan, that was published in the volume White Nile, Black Blood, that was published in the year 2000. And that was focusing on the European presence in the Sudan and in the area of White Nile and Blue Nile, where Khartoum is located, and the way the encounters and the transactions took place at that time. Just a few words about the collection, just to give you an idea. It was donated in 1862. It's not a full collection because Binder chose to split it and also exhibited it in Vienna prior to arriving in Sibiu. Which leads us to believe that his initial intent was to, of course, to donate it to a museum and to a scientific society, but also to build up his status by exhibiting and claiming the scientific status that actually was not initially his own the moment he left Transylvania and he chose to travel around. The objects were collected and brought to Sibiu, And they were received here with a great enthusiasm, and the collection was considered a very valuable one from the very beginning, and was considered a donation as coming from a prince, because it was very valuable, and it is still considered one of the most important European collections of items coming from the tribes along the White Nile, since Franz Binder was one of the first white person to travel along the shores of the White Nile towards the sources of it. So far, the curatorial approaches of this collection have ignored, actually, as irrelevant, the very conditions of its formation. So the objects were very often, actually, were never exhibited as coming from an area that was subject to colonial rule at the time. It was part of the empire, the Egyptian Turkish Empire. So, and it was never conceived as being an image and materiality reflecting the colonial relationships that shaped at that time the entire dynamics between white people, Europeans mainly, traveling to North Africa in our case. The important thing, I think, I really want to emphasize in my presentation, is that in Romania and in our museum, this dimension, the colonial dimension, was never perceived as such. It was never exhibited, and because it was considered that since Transylvania and Romania generally not having been a colonial administration, was never it was never relevant for the collections that was formed in the 19th century to question the way they were gathered. Actually, recent research proves that Franz Binder has reached his rich status as being involved in, for sure, ivory and most likely slave trade in and around Khartoum. And he also was in his journal and his account, he often displays not only an orientalistic approach towards the populations he encountered, but also he tried to cover them, under the curiosity of a European that's, traveling around and contributing to European science as in discovering territories that have been uncharted before. Of course, this is not new. I'm sure I'm not telling you any novelty, because this was the general mainstream of the explorers that have reached those territories back then. These are just some images of the collection I have put here, but I don't think I have the time to go into that. So my idea and my proposal for the organization of our museum is to enlarge the colonial context beyond polarization between colonial and colonized regions, in order to discern the gray area of influences that the Europeans had in colonized areas. So Franz Binder was a representative of the Austro-Hungarian Empire there, but it was not because he left, he was not a diplomat at origin, and he had not left the country in order to do that. It was just by circumstances that brought him into that position. And even if this region has never been a colonial power overseas, or had never organized exploration, exploitation travels around, it is still the way that it was organized, including the way the collection has been received here. It's a reception of the public and of the society that to which the collection was donated, shows a mainstream European white privileged way of receiving this kind of
Adriana, how about you just give us like, one sentence or two sentences of just wrapping up your argument, and because it's a very interesting paper.
Yeah, it's very difficult to put it in 10 minutes. I really tried. So generally my research is based on exoticism as a general umbrella under which all these collections have been formed in Transylvania, the old collections in the 19th century. And I intend to incorporate various sources, and I propose the idea of incorporating the various sources in future displays, exhibitional displays, in order not to focus on objects, but about the cultural history of the objects and how the context and the self-reflectivity of the museum, which is not the self-reflectivity of Franz Binder as he wanted us to believe.
Thank you so much. It's really a fascinating story, and I really see so many points of contact between what Lenny was saying and you, and I'm looking forward to the to the discussion. I think Yuan is right. Okay, so now we're going to move to Yuan Navashilevska, who is Yuan Navashilevska is an art historian who is working on the kind of context between Asia and Poland. And she is currently employed at the Asian Pacific Museum in Warsaw, where she's been working since 1992. And she is also the director of the really fabulous museum. I can recommend everyone to go there. And as the curator, she's focusing on East and Southeast Asia's cultures, heritage. And obviously that entails intercultural relations as well. And I'm very much looking forward to your talk. Joanna, 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Everyone's listening me? Yes? Yes, okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen too. I will try at least. Yes, sure. Usually I really hate reading my papers, but I think having this 10 minutes, this will be more efficient than just free speech. So I will try to do it this way. I wanted to start this presentation with this maybe allusion to the Polish saying about the elephant and the Polish question. My foreign colleagues maybe don't know it, but still. And to present the hero of this story and the protagonist, in 1973, the Nusantara Museum was founded in Warsaw, renamed very boldly 3 years later as the Asia and Pacific Museum, and holding this name until today, even if, as Tokimasa Sekiguchi wrote provocatively, Asia does not exist. Its founder, Andrzej Wawrzyniak, who is presented on this picture, was a diplomat and member of the Communist Party, but at the same time rather unusual for his group and period, collector and traveler, whatever the meaning of this word, which also should be discussed. From his early age, he also created strongly his image and persona as an explorer of exotic countries. His Indonesian collection, created in the 1960s, and here you have some pictures presenting the very beginnings of this collection, followed some patterns and choices of Dutch colonial collections, and so did some of his practices and attitudes, as documented by the photos of the period, by his own declarations and media coverage of the time. As many authors already wrote, and I definitely support this point of view, Polish collections are not directly of colonial origins for obvious reasons, although some of them are mirroring colonial ambitions of Poland or Poles. There are some indirect sources, usually views and knowledge of the East as seen through the West, through the lens of Western-born Orientalism, through a kind of second-hand Orientalism. These Polish collectors and Polish travelers throughout the ages rather always showed the tendency of identification with Europe, with the West, with white man's burden in colonial times, so which such cases like Niemcewicz in America in the 18th century, or Sienkiewicz in Africa in 19th, or Fiedler in South America or Madagascar in 20th century, these kinds of attitudes. By the way, I'm waiting with curiosity for Sarah Herzyńska paper of which will be held tomorrow. And rather, these travelers and collectors rather shared the dreams of colonial power than empathy or sympathy for the colonized locals, not identifying with them. Very significant for me is the attitude of Henryk Sienkiewicz, who, as a young man in the United States, found some affinities between local and Polish history, but in his later age and his later travel to Africa, he rather admires Germans in Africa, the same Germans whom he perceived and he presented to some degree in his books as occupants and enemies on the Polish grounds, but then in the foreign ground, feeling much closer to them than to the colonized nations. As Adam Kola wrote in his book 2 years ago, involvement in the previously unknown countries on the same side of Iron Curtain after the Second World War became rather unexpected, and maybe it came for the country and the society not really prepared for this kind of change of mind. Official international solidarity with the so-called third world or developing countries in the period was declared, but mostly superficial and rather had a propaganda dimension. In this context, Andrzej Wawrzyniak was active since the late 50s, making his diplomatic career, having strong political support, very good contacts on the highest levels of politics, and so a kind of VIP position. But also he had a deep curiosity of surrounding worlds and strong instinct of collecting and also competing, which is also important. He still, even today, presents himself as sailor, diplomat, and collector, a kind of self-construction very much preserved and presented. As he said in some book many years ago already, I will say, I had no professional background, but from today's point of view, I can see that I had a lot of intuition and a big luck. And then I traveled a lot throughout Indonesia. I reached the places rarely visited by Europeans. In this time of Poland's relative isolation, a private collection later transformed into a public museum, and this was really a huge collection because of when it was changed. When the museum was started after the collection, it was over 4,000 pieces, 4,000 exhibits. So such a collection transformed into a museum gained an interest of the broad audience and an important feedback in the press, radio, and early TV productions of the time. Striking to one degree, in the post-colonial time, in the non-colonial country and the anti-colonial official political context, quasi-colonial narrative was created by the owner, by the founder of the museum, but also by the media and his admirers, I can say. This kind of narrative was presented and accepted, shaping and confirming at the same time views of the audience. Museums' early activities, as can be seen, for instance, here on these press clippings, their documentation and media presentations focus strongly on exoticism, aesthetic values of the collection, and adventurous collecting process as itself. For instance, to cite one of this early media relations from 1966, a review from Dziennik Polski daily. This is art in its most primitive genetic function. art which still possesses magical meaning, the author writes. And further, and this is about the Balinese, mostly Balinese art, and later examples of contemporary art are unfortunately, stressing, another word already, what he later explains as being influenced or spoiled by Western art, superficially only adapted. And on the other hand, 2 or 3 years ago, another journalist wrote about the same collection and very probably about the same pieces as the true unspoiled art of Bali. Probably these 2 pieces which are present now were also present on both presentations at the period. The collections criteria, maybe we show something else. Okay. The collections criteria, however, by the collector himself, were mostly aesthetics, but also what was found at the time at authenticity of the object and also mystery. And this notion of mystery, of mysterious East, is a really a kind of trait which comes throughout all the history of the museum, especially early history of the museum. And since the specific choice of collected objects, among them the krises and other weapons of Indonesia, with their magic combined successfully all these 3 values, being aesthetically appealing, being authentic part of local culture, and being mysterious. Here I am showing just a few other press clippings presenting the collection as the biggest in Poland or even biggest in the world, what is obviously not true. A private museum of Malay cultures, and presenting also the personality of the owner, and then after handling the collection to the museum director, the part of this collection was really broadly presented in the press in the late 60s and early 70s. Then I must say that also Andrzej Wawrzyniak, in his ways of collecting and presenting, also refer to authority and competences of local actors, of local collectors, dealers, specialists, and also he included these contacts and these authorities into his narrative, like in this case when he involved local dukuns or shamans in Indonesia, hiring them to care for his kris collection before bringing into Poland, and to preserve the weapons with traditional methods and also with spiritual power. Then the new museum, when already founded as officially and the public organization, both inspired research and knowledge and endorsed unwillingly but very strongly stereotypes of mysterious East or Southern Seas, as the first titles of the first exhibition sounded. And this mysterious East, until today, I say usually that this is a kind of a curse of our museum, which we are now fighting rather quite effectively, I hope, but still. This is one of the first, in the first period of the museum's existence, as you can see in 73, one of these first presentations. What is striking for me today, that given the political context of the creation of this collection and creation of the museum, there is virtually no political context in these ways of presentation. Sometimes only some introduction prefaces to catalogs, there were mentions about international friendships, about some shared political values, but in the way of presentation, these were mostly aesthetics, and of course also some attempts to present some aspects of local cultures of Indonesia. But this lack of political involvement is very visible from today's perspective. Still just a few pieces of the press of the period, sometimes with really very fantastic stories, which was both I think loved to tell by the collector himself, but also the journalists also were loving these kinds of stories. Just an example, just a few titles: My Collector's Adventures, Daggers and Demos, and at the end, Wawrzyniak's Folly, very visibly an allusion to Konrad, when there are just two things shared by these two personages, yes, the Polish origins and Indonesian context. But this is very, very typical, I think, for this kind of presentation. What is interesting also for me, I know I'm already at the end nearly. What is interesting that only after many years I can say found again the early photos of Andrzej Wawrzyniak traveling throughout the Asian countries, which were, I'm rather surprised that he didn't use them in the promotional activities throughout these years. They were rather neglected, and no, they really provide a very interesting material. Now, today we face the new challenge to create a new and the first in the Museum's history permanent exhibition. For years already, a new generation of curators is working for change of this mysterious East vision, too long in use. However, we decided for some quite traditional geographical construction of the display, which will be called Journey to the East. Then we want to indicate that the collection at its history mirrors a Polish and European gaze directed to the East, to the huge and complex part of the world traditionally described as Asia. We also want to draw the visitor's attention to the context in which collections were created and perceived, and the accompanying program should also include the reflections on Western and specifically Polish attitudes towards foreign cultures and their heritage. What we still do, what we are doing for many years already in our cultural activities. This new project at the end, I want to say, is our point of view, is today's point of view, and also I strongly believe it is not forever, and I wonder what will the next generation do with the same collection and its story. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joanna. It's again like a very, I think, inspiring and like thought-provoking kind of glimpse into how museums try to deal with the kind of colonial legacy, right? And that's very. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion because I can see so many, connections with what Adriana was saying. But now the time is to actually give Tina Palaic the floor. Tina Palaic is an ethnologist, a cultural anthropologist, and she's a curator in a museum. At the same time, she's also conducting a PhD research at the Faculty of Arts in Slovenia at the University of Ljubljana. And she is very much interested in this kind of legacy of the non-alignment movement in Yugoslavia. So the floor is yours, Tina.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Yeah. Thank you, Lynn, very much for your nice introductory words. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm also looking forward to the discussion after those presentations, because I also see, as you said, Lynn, a lot of parallels between already presented papers and as well parallels with mine. So I will start sharing my screen. No, this is not. Yeah, so in my presentation, I will explore the best museological practices and knowledge production in the Slovene Ethnographic Museum from the second half of the 20th century. And as Lynn already said, I'm very much interested in the legacy of the non-aligned movement and its influence on the Slovene Ethnographic Museum's branch, which was established in 1964, and it's with the name Museum of Non-European Cultures. So in the second half of the 20th century, Slovenia was one of the 6 republics of former Yugoslavia. And Yugoslav foreign policy focused very much on the non-aligned movement, actually influenced the field of museology in Slovenia quite largely, I would say. The majority of the non-European ethnographic collections from earlier period were transferred to the newly established museum, the Museum of Non-European Cultures, and later on complemented with objects from all over the world that were collected through different collaborations and exchanges with other non-aligned countries. Additionally, there was also an extensive exhibition program with nearly 40 traveling exhibitions, also from other non-aligned countries. Unfortunately, in 2001, the Museum of Non-European Cultures was closed, and all the non-European ethnographic collections were transferred to the Slovene Ethnographic Museum, and they are still there today. The key question of my presentation is whether we can create new and more appropriate strategies and visions of presenting non-European collections in Slovenia on the basis of specific anti-colonial principles from the non-aligned movement, rather than simply follow mainstream Western decolonial attempts. I will first share some thoughts about collecting policy, knowledge production, and collaborative practices developed in the Museum of Non-European Cultures in Ljubljana, and then try to give some conclusions. And I am also very much looking forward to all your comments and questions to help me make my thoughts or my conclusions clearer. So first, collecting policy. The museum's first collections were given or sold to the Slovene Ethnographic Museum by missionaries, sea travelers, diplomats, travelers from the mid-19th century onwards, so like in other cases. Even though majority of Slovenes who were at the time part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, because Slovenian territory was also part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so even though those people were not directly involved in colonial violence, they were implicated in the colonial projects in many ways. And here I built my thought on Michael Rothberg's writings and also Walter Sauer's writings. So some of Slovenes from that time, of course, participated in colonial endeavors of Western colonial powers, like, for example, Anton Kodeli, who was commissioned by Germany to build a radio telegraph station in Togo. And others simply represented particular strategies of European overseas expansion. For example, religious, commercial, cultural, and also political interests. And here you can see one of the examples, missionary Friedrich Baraga, who worked in the area of Great Lakes of North America, and actually his the objects he collected there were the first non-European objects obtained in the Slovene territory in 1837. And one more thing, additionally, similar ideas about non-European territories and peoples were propagated through circulation of colonial and imperial literature. And this is also one of the important aspects we have to highlight when we speak about these colonial dimensions in our part of the world. With the foundation of the non-aligned movement, new ideas and principles of solidarity and friendship emerged. The movement advocated for peaceful coexistence, economic balance, and territorial integrity. Yugoslavia, who was one of the founders of the movement, supported anti-colonial struggles and emphasized the importance of culture. Many exchanges and collaborations in the field of culture, in the cultural field, were held in that time. However, some of the colonial ideas of Western domination and civilizational superiority unfolded through different Yugoslav projects aiming to bring progress to other non-aligned countries, particularly those on the African continent. There is someone who has a mic on.
Yeah, could you please everybody mute yourselves?
Thank you. It's just really hard to speak. Okay. So here I built on writings from Catherine Baker and Konstantin Kilibarda and also many In the Museum of Non-European Cultures, those ideas, so ideas of civilizational superiority, Western domination, progress, development, were evident in the aim of the museum to supplement existing collections in order to show the development and progress of different societies. Additionally, there were no theoretically defined systematic and planned collecting policy. Museum of Non-European Cultures was at that time satisfied with coincidental acquisitions. And here you can see few ways or few ways how those collections were obtained by the museum. So for example, collaboration with Slovene collectors. One of them was also Aleš Weber, ambassador to Indonesia, who actually met the previously mentioned Andrej Vajniek. Maybe I didn't pronounce it well, but yeah, that's also interesting how those people actually met in foreign lands. And then also through collaboration with artists, several artists donated or sold objects to the Slovene Ethnographic Museum, or its branch, actually, Museum of Non-European Cultures from that time. And the result of these collecting practices is that there is far more to tell about collectors rather than collected material and societies it was acquired, those objects were acquired from. The second is knowledge production. There is actually only one person who extensively wrote on non-European collections at the Museum of Non-European Cultures, and that was museum curator Paula Struckel. You can see her here on the picture. Her knowledge derived from the available literature of the time, mainly monographs written by different German, French, and British scholars, as well as foreign journals and catalogs of foreign museums' collections. Paula Struckel did not write about her practices. Instead, she focused on collectors and their collections from the 19th century. Her writings show a tendency to distinguish Slovenes who traveled to non-European places for different reasons from local people they met and also collected the objects from. She presented missionaries, travelers, and seafarers in line with white colonialists by describing collectors as heroic protagonists who were sacrificing themselves for their cause. They were presented as individuals with agency in opposition to the passive group of indigenous people. And here you can see some of quotations from her work. Missionaries are described as bearers of civilization who brought important knowledge for indigenous people to better their life. There is a clear lack of historical and social contexts in Struckel's texts, which would allow us to understand the role and impact of missionary work on indigenous people, as well as their agency in the given situation. And my third, let's say, chapter is collaborative practices. So between 1964 and 1990, Paula Struckel and the then museum's director Boris Kuhar organized almost 40 traveling exhibitions coming from different countries from across the world. Those exhibitions were part of the series entitled Non-Aligned Cultures and were based on curatorial approaches and interests of sending countries. The museum also translated exhibition catalogs, which usually provided geographical and historical information about the presented country or information about an artist. Here are two examples of those catalogs. Each catalog holds a clear statement that the aim of the exhibition was to present past and present ways of living and thus contribute to the better knowledge about the presented people. Paula Struckel also organized a whole range of different events that, in addition to the objects themselves, introduced also other aspects of heritage. She herself gave lectures. She also invited collectors and other people with experience of traveling abroad to give a talk. She played films from all around the world, organized different workshops. For instance, which is very fascinating for me, Japanese ikebana flower arrangement. Then also Indonesian traditional shadow puppet theater, which was done by Indonesian student. And also she organized some dance performances and music concerts done by, performed by African students. What is even more I see it. Thank you. What is even more important, she extensively collaborated with foreign students who came to study in Slovenia. And based on her work reports, she collaborated with them in order to get additional information about museum artifacts, to get new objects for the museum collections, to organize and perform several events. And also, as you can see here on the slide, to participate in TV shows where students had the opportunity to present their knowledge and practices to wider audience. Struckel also collaborated with student organizations, mostly with the Association of African Students in Slovenia, which asked her to help with their exhibitions and events as well. So it was mutual collaboration. To come to my conclusion, to my final thoughts. So my research shows that the colonial and anti-colonial discourses were both intertwined at that time, and that both influenced the museological practices in the Museum of Non-European Cultures. The two concepts from that time, which I find very inspiring, and at least we as curators in the Slovene Ethnographic Museum should use them as a starting point for the future museum work, are collaboration with source communities and participation of heritage bearers with non-European backgrounds in the processes of collecting, preserving, and interpreting heritage. This is one of the ways of enabling proliferation of discourses around heritage. When heritage bearers provide their own experience, practices, and understanding of the heritage, this enables sharing of the authority over knowledge production and guarantees more equal power relations in these processes. And this is something that we really try to bring forward in the Slovene Ethnographic Museum at the moment, also with our different collaborations with other European ethnographic museums. So this is all for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tina, for this wonderful presentation and the kind of try to connect it with the 20th century and non-alignment movement. I think that there might be some connection with what Mathieu is doing, given the kind of cultural diplomacy aspect. But now let's just, this is our final talk in this panel. And I would like to invite Mathieu Labert, I hope that I pronounced it well, who is a senior lecturer in contemporary history at the University of Fribourg, if I'm not mistaken, that's in Switzerland. He's a specialist in the history of cultural diplomacy and especially during the Cold War. At the same time, he has also published a monograph on Warsaw, on the history of Warsaw. So there's a lot of kind of transnational, but also very micro-historical, if you want, elements in his work. And now he's basically working on very similar topics that I am working on, which is a global history of social movements. And it so happens that in November, we'll be part of the same talk in Paris. So it's kind of nice to meet Mathieu now in Warsaw at this workshop. So Mathieu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this presentation. And I will share here my presentation, if it's work. And I would like to thank the organizers for their incredible ingenuity to switch the conference into this online environment. And secondly, I apologize for the somewhat tinker nature of my presentation. I was 10 days in quarantine with my children until yesterday, and my presentation is maybe not optimal. However, I'm very happy to be here and to share some reflections based on my research on the presence of foreign students, particularly from the Third World in Poland during the Cold War. How to link this historical topic with museum policies toward post-colonialism? I asked myself this question while visiting the Warsaw Museum, especially as I was in the portrait room. Here you have a picture of this portrait room.
Excuse me, Mathieu, I think we can see your pictures. We can see the text. So I guess you could, try to switch the screen.
Excuse me. Yeah.
No problem.
Is it okay?
Yes, now we see the slides. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I saw this portrait of Jasmine August Agbola O'Brown, who lived in Warsaw and even fought for the city in the uprising of 1944. Hanging next to the portrait of Bolesław Bierut, it remembered the presence of students from the Third World in Poland under the People's Republic. The question then arose as to how Third World students could or should be presented in a museum such as the Museum of Warsaw. In other words, in the framework of our conference about the decolonization of museum, we could ask, should decolonization be operated only on museum collections, or should museum take into account, which is already being done more and more, the colonial past for understanding the present? These foreign students belong to the few people from the colonial and post-colonial world that the local populations has been confronted with during the second half of the 20th century. The second wave of such confrontations came with the increase in the number of refugees in Europe in the refugee crisis in 2015. At that time, several observers have noted the persistence of an East-West divide in the perceptions of refugees. They pointed to the difference in attitudes between Western Europe and the former Eastern Bloc towards foreigners. In Eastern Europe, the absence of a colonial and immigration past would explain the difficulty of confronting racialized otherness. It's not the point here whether it's right or wrong. However, it seems that a different relationships has been built up in relations to otherness in Europe, and that this difference can be partly explained by the Iron Curtain. In the former Eastern Europe, one could observe a similar going from participation in this global socialist bloc towards European integration. Between those two phases, there were no or very few confrontations with foreigners. In the field of higher education, the Eastern countries have mostly adapted their universities to the European system and created a lot of private institutions. The number of foreign students has fallen, while a large number of Central European students were opting for mobility in Western Europe. Since 2000, the number of incoming students increased again, but these populations has been Europeanized. In 2017, 80% of foreign students came from Europe. For student mobility, the fall of communism corresponds also to a new European whiteness. Thus, for the present, the last experience of confrontation with extra-European foreigners go back to the experience under communist rules, especially with foreign students from the socialist Third World. This story is subject to a double perspective that I would like to present here. The first is a top-down perspective, how the presence of these students was instrumentalized by the communist power. And the second perspective is from below. How did this confrontation with foreign students work in the everyday life? The arrival of foreign students in Poland follows a pattern that one could find in other Eastern Bloc countries. Around the 1960s, there was an increase in Third World students. This trend continued until the end of the 70s and even later in some countries. In some countries, this education policy is visible in the public space. In Moscow, the People's Friendships University, here, which was renamed the Patrice Lumumba University, was built in 1961. In Prague, the campus of the University of 17th November was built for foreign students in the same year. And there is also in Prague a building dedicated to the International Union of Students, was which was built in 1974. You have here a picture. There is not such monument in Poland. The most famous international center, the Polish Language Study Center for Foreigners in Łódź, is not particularly visible as a trace of this past in the public space. In Poland, the number of foreign students remained more modest, as this graph shows in a comparison with Czechoslovakia. However, it was not insignificant, and several institutions were created with the aim of hosting foreign students, learning them Polish language, and supervising their activities. The arrival of foreign students began with 132 North Koreans arriving in Łódź in 1952. It is not so clear why this first group of students were sent to Łódź. One reason might be that this recent university was a model for the new socialist standard for higher education. But the universities of Warsaw or Krakow, for example, would have more experience since they organized summer school for Polish language already in the interwar period. The arrival of students in Poland showed that Poland is part of a general trend of the communist bloc. Third World was becoming a battlefield between the blocs in order to attract and to influence the elites of these new independent countries. On the other side, such foreign policies in education served to show that the country was modern. By hosting foreign students, Poland belonged to the technological modernity compared to countries that were not yet modern and considered in development. Finally, hosting foreign students make it possible to place Poland at the center of the world, as shown on this map. Foreign students were marked in the public space by the scientific diplomacy of a communist bloc country. They were presented as socialist brothers and sisters, but from countries considered backwards from a development perspective. Their presence is thus staged by the communist power as a political legitimation. Maybe the most significant example is the War Festival of youth and students in Warsaw in 1955. Of course, other representations were visible also in the local context of Łódź, as you can see here in this newspaper of Dziennik Popularny. This propaganda reinforces the exoticism of these Black students and thus a relationship of domination. At the 1955 festival, a delegation leader in Łódź reported that the young people, the Polish young people in his city, were mainly interested in these people from exotic countries. The use of these students by the authorities is not only through propaganda. They are widely used in espionage, both in Poland and abroad. Scientists have also taken part in the student mobility policies. In 1963, the African Institute was founded at the University of Warsaw with the aim of contributing to the work of reconstruction and social and cultural development of decolonized countries. According to the editorial of the first issue of the journal of this African Institute, this knowledge was able to develop in Poland thanks socialism. So it is questionable whether in communist countries, the relationship with the students was only based on the racial or cultural alterity, or if this relationship was influenced by the relation of the citizens to the communist power. The students were part of the propaganda panoply of the government. The constructions of alterity under communist rules would be also influenced by the political context. But how? And it is my second point. This persistent exoticism represented by these young people from the Third World in a Central European city appears as a new barrier in the Cold War. This seems to be largely unexplored by historians. This is a work in progress on my side, that I'm currently carrying out. But we can already distinguish 3 ways of understanding these relationships. The first way it is the mediatization of this presence. The study of the press is interesting for 2 reasons. On the one hand, some journalists show an independence of view which allows them to grasp the issues surrounding this presence. This is the case, for example, of the article by Yuan Navashilevska, which compares the contact of the population with students in Poland and Western Europe. In Poland, the contacts are particularly difficult, and one reason would be the disinterest of Polish students. It is interesting to see that this tradition of report within the foreign student community begins in the 60s, here with this article of Jan Jakubec in the same review. And at this time, we can see the same articles in the West. On the other hand, media allow to understand a kind of infra-life through, for example, announcement published for or by foreign students. For example, here, where a student is looking for a room. The second way of understanding this relationship between foreign students and population are the places, especially clubs, student clubs that do not exist anymore. For example, in Łódź, Nova Africa, in ulica Zachodna, or in Warsaw, the club Czech Kontynentów, which ceased its activities in 1974. Police reports make it possible to find out about some of the activities. However, these comments are very much based on the colonial view of students, who often appear as profiteers, pleasure and sexuality. This shows that the vision of these foreign students from the point of view of the power bodies is not uniform. These often racist reports contrast with the propaganda about socialist brothers and sisters. And the first way to understanding this relationship between foreign students and local population are testimonies of former students. Students' testimonies shed light on this experience in Poland. This is work that still needs to be done, even if we already have databases, thanks, for example, to this book and interviews that we can read within this book, Warszawiacy nie z tej ziemi. And it should be pointed out also that the Łódź Center already undertook such a study in the 1980s when the institution was threatened with closure. And so, to conclude, media, places, and testimonies are traces, certainly among others. They would be tell us something about the construction of alterity in this European region. They could be shown, but should also be collected. And this is one of my goals in my research project. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you, everyone, for these really interesting presentations. And there almost is some kind of a theological here, you know, a passage of time from 19th century, this kind of peak of colonialism to this kind of late socialism and kind of transition to, you know, post-89 Poland. Really interesting. And now I would like to open the floor or the chat room for the questions. So please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. I see that there's a lot of exchange of ideas here, but also articles. So that's a wonderful resource. But any questions here? There's one for Tina from Emina. So Tina, are there any collaborations between the former Yugoslavian countries that kind of manifest themselves in similar projects?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Actually, no. For now, there hasn't been any official collaboration in any project, but we have established some contacts with curators in Zagreb, for instance, in the Ethnographic Museum of Zagreb, and also Museum of African Art from Belgrade, and Museum of Yugoslavia. So there has been some, let's say, discussions about how to approach non-European collections, but we haven't really formalized our attempts. But I can mention one very inspiring scholar from Belgrade, Ana Sladojevic. She did her PhD on the Museum of African Art, and her findings are really, really amazing.
Thank you. Any other questions, or if not, then I'm going to take the the prerogative as a chair. And I mean, it was really interesting to see how the talk by Lenny and Adriana basically completely debunks, or like the myth of this perceived innocence of Eastern Europe simply because we did not have colonies, which is like a very open question when you think about the interwar politics of Poland and Ukraine, right? That so this is a very problematic statement in many ways, but it's kind of really nice to see that you both give like empirical evidence showing that there was a very strong entanglement, and in fact profit benefits stemming from the fact that the Polish people would go and and conduct research and build their careers and set up institutions by kind of directly contributing to the colonial praxis, right? And that is very interesting. And I was thinking about, I think it was Adriana who used this kind of, I'm not sure who it was, but used this kind of secondhand colonialism term. And I thought about this kind of notion of Eastern Europe being at the kind of border zone of Europe, let's say. And I immediately thought about, obviously, the classic books by Larry Wolff, Inventing Eastern Europe, or Maria Todorova, how our region, basically how Eastern Europe was also seen as a kind of not quite white, not quite civilized, let's put it like that. And so maybe this is kind of, what do we do with these two facts, right? Where really, I mean, is there any kind of, is it productive to read one phenomenon through the other, and I mean, does it matter that Eastern Europe was not seen as white? I mean, this is also the problem of whiteness, because, for example, the Irish people were not seen as white when they arrived in the United States, right? There's this whole discussion that they were not black, but not like, Protestant privileged white people from the East Coast. And the same thing seems to be happening to the Eastern Europeans, that they are, if you want, physically white, but in terms of culturally, they're not seen as fully white by Western Europeans. And so there's all of these kind of entanglements, open questions, and I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but I think it's just me trying to wrap my head around it. And the question is how to distinguish white from whiteness, that kind of different variations of whiteness. And it's not just about skin pigment, right? But it's very much about this kind of cultural capital, hierarchies, and so on. And since both Lena and Adriana, you basically talk about also how the Eastern European sciences, they basically contributed to one of the most shameful histories of academic practice, which is the scientific racism that had this peak in the 19th century and basically led to genocidal practices, right? So this is just like my food for thought, throwing it out there. Whoever wants, please chip in.
So I can start. So that's basically talking about differentiating, talking about race, and talking about more actors in the colonial world is one of the central questions of my project and my work. Just to give voices, and the way that I come at these questions are, of course, I study the Prussian partition and how colonial views used by Germans were building a discourse of inferiority to the Poles that were administrated in the Prussian Polish provinces. But I was also interested in Polish reactions towards that discourse, and it's through the works of the explorers, travelers, collectors, and all of that that I was able to study like the different positionalities and how they were counteracting these discourses, and how in Europe medical discourses were labeling Poles as inferior, but then when they move to Africa or Brazil, they benefit from this privileged position of being white. So that's a constant interest that I have in my work. And basically what I try to show is how this colonial relations travel back to Europe, especially in the scientific works, especially medicine benefited from it, and anthropology, and how these discourses are, share and how they build one another. So that's what I mean.
If I may add something.
Of course.
In my research and from my perspective, I'm also concerned. Yes, it's true that colonialism is not that perceived as such here in Romania, but I'm also concerned more maybe with the way that institutions choose historically, like in the 20th century alone, choose to present this kind of context and research on collections provenance, or choose not to present it. I think it's not only a matter of not having documented the collection, but also a matter of choice in the post-communism era, like from 90 onwards, a choice not to get entangled with sensitive ideas like colonialism, imperialism, and so on, because it was the museum that I represent was very freshly initiated in the 90s, early 90s, after the revolution. So the perception back then was that maybe we should play safe and not present, not get entangled in the anti-imperial, anti-colonial discourse of the communist regime that was going on and on and on, especially when it came to the relationships developed with African countries and so on. So it's like two perspectives. Not only that, of course, at the time colonial entanglements were less perceived, like in the 19th century, and less talk about it, but also it's also a matter of how institutions kept on perpetuating this image, and the fact that the public perception nowadays is very, very lacks this dimension in the perspective, let's say, to put it nicely. Thank you.
I guess it's also just very kind of nice to see that there is this kind of will and capacity to kind of rethink the legacy, colonial legacy of the museums, and create this kind of, one of you used the term self-reflective museum, which I thought was really nice. But it's also like a very, powerful tool, right, for kind of reclaiming this past. And there's another question for Tina from Anna. So Anna very much enjoyed your talk, Tina, and she would like to ask you how specifically the collaboration between the communities, the one that you call them source communities, and museums can look like today. And do you have any contemporary examples that could illustrate this type of collaboration?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I actually shared one of my projects that dealt with that question. It was, I believe, in 2017, in the Slovene Ethnographic Museum, we did an exhibition about the non-aligned movement, and we tried to deliver several perspectives on this issue. So we included people who donated the objects to the museum, so those collectors. And then on the other hand, we invited students, former students from African countries, to come to the museum to comment on those collections, and also to bring their own personal objects from that time. And our aim was actually to bring together all their experience, feelings of belonging to both countries, so the country of origin and Slovenia, or Yugoslavia and now Slovenia. We also focused on the question of integration into Slovene society. So if you want to speak more about practical components of that work, it was quite how to say, exhaustive in one way. A lot of emotional input. But at the end, we got much more, how to say, valid museum narrative. It was really important for us to give this place to the people who were actually part of that experience, to also ask some questions, to tell their own dilemmas about their own positioning in the society. So it was in a form of workshops and later on personal or individual conversations with all of them.
Thank you. We are running a bit out of time, but let me just maybe read one question for Lenny so that more speakers can jump in here. And so first of all, congratulations for Lenny to the award. Lenny got an award for a book. That's really great. And the question is, Poland, as we know it today, did not come into existence as an independent country until 1918. In this case, people of one of the three Polands that existed prior to that date, who explored South America or Africa, could not be said to be doing so for the purposes of colonization on behalf of Poland. I wonder whether you could talk a bit more about that. Thank you. Lenny, would you like to answer?
Thank you so much for the questions, Balaji. So in my work, I talk about colonial fantasies prior to the interwar period, because it's not until the interwar period that these colonial projects are on behalf of the nation state. And my purpose of talking about colonial fantasies is studying colonialism in the cultural realm and the way that Poles use colonies to put themselves at a equal standing with other Europeans, and also how express these feelings of being left behind, that made them to engage into these explorations. So the short answer to your question is that I'm talking about colonial fantasies because I'm aware of the fact that Poland was partitioned between three empires, but it's interesting how the condition of being partitioned didn't stop them to be engaged in overseas colonies.
More question to Adriana and Tina. Did the collectors, explorers, or missionaries exchange knowledge and scientific experiences with quotation imperial European countries in the 19th and 20th centuries? So was there any exchange here? That's the examples of the Portugal Empire, French, the English one, the Dutch one, the Belgian, and the Italian. Tina or Adriana, would you like to answer this question?
Yes.
Okay, Adriana.
Okay, yes, very short. Well, at that moment, Transylvania was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and including the Society for Transylvania Society for Natural Sciences was, of course, built on a Western model. But mostly, those explorers, Franz Binder was not the only one; it's just the most prominent due to his collection. But there were little exchanges with the Western countries, the colonial, like as mentioned in your question. Although there were a lot of published materials in German, of course, because it was a Saxon city, and most of the collectors were also Saxon. So no and yes.
Tina, would you like to briefly add something to that?
Yeah, very briefly. For the 19th century, there is one very interesting case of a missionary, Ignatius Knoblechar, who went to the River Nile, as Adriana spoke about. What was his name again? Franz Binder. This person came to my mind. It's not. This is not my expertise at all, but I know that he did some scientific measurements of the River Nile, and he also wrote a diary with all the information about the Nile and so on, and he tried to find the spring of it, and he was in contact with researchers from Great Britain and also from France, and they exchanged the results of this research. So there was some kind of collaboration.
So thank you so much. We are already 2 minutes. No, but Adriana, would you like to add something?
Very shortly, this group of collectors, of Saxon collectors, mostly were oriented towards natural sciences like flora and fauna. I know it's not far from the interest of the early anthropological interests of natural anthropology, but these were not the main preoccupations of those collectors back here in Transylvania. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank again, big applaud for our speakers, and I wish we had a bit more time to be able to kind of really, unearth and unwrap everything you said. I have tons of questions for Mathieu, but maybe, before the Paris thingy, we can just have a bit of a chat. Thank you so much for the audience, and thank you for the organizers, and we have to wrap it up, but I see you at the next panels and perhaps at the breakout rooms tonight. Have a nice evening, everyone. Thank you.